Dr. Dukes, who is a professor of forestry and natural resources at Purdue University, is also part of a national network of leading climate change scholars and researchers across 27 departments at Purdue. In addition to his teaching responsibilities, he's the director of the Boston Area Climate Experiment and the leader of the Interface Research Coordination Network. Today, I think he's mostly going to be talking from his position as director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. The Purdue's Climate Change Research Center brings together researchers from multiple departments at Purdue to address the complex and disciplinary challenge of climate change. And most recently, his work highlights the importance of a variety of ecological processes for future climate. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Dukes.
So I want to talk to you today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to talk with you today about the future climate in Indiana, the current climate in Indiana, and what the implications of that are for transportation, infrastructure, and planning in general. So next slide would be great. So we live in times of rapid change. The climate is changing, our technology is changing, our energy systems are changing, our communications are changing, and all of this will play into the presentation that I'm giving you today. But first I want to start with climate with the next slide, just pointing out that there's, at this current time, we have very rapid change in both the mean global temperature, which you see here in red, and it goes back and forth a bit from year to year, but the long-term trend is very much going up. And the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and the concentration of heat-trapping gases in general, which you see in yellow here, those two are going up together, and it's not a coincidence that they are. We know that carbon dioxide is a strong heat-trapping gas, and as we emit more of that and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we continue to raise the temperature of the planet at a rate that's only faster and faster over time. Next slide. So when we hear about these changes, often it's in the context of things that are far away, like, oh, the poor polar bear is up, you know, they're having problems, or, you know, maybe something up in Alaska or the tundra. And that makes sense because the climate is changing the fastest up there in the Arctic. But what we need to know about, next slide, is really the implications for Indiana, right? What's happening here at home? And we don't hear about that as much. And so today I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking a lot about results that we've come up with as part of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. And this is a project that is led by the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, which I direct, but it's had contributions from dozens of organizations around the state, researchers at University of Notre Dame, at IU, at IUPUI, and other institutions, some of our state agencies, and really just people all around the state have contributed their time to make this assessment happen. Next slide, please. The assessment has 10 initial reports planned, and you can advance this one. You can access all of these reports at indianaclimate.org. And the 8 reports that are highlighted right now have all come out. I'll be focusing a lot on results that are in the climate report today, but also some of the other reports, and including a sneak peek at one of the reports that hasn't come out yet on water resources. That is coming soon, as I think you'll see on the next advancement, and a report on infrastructure coming out after that. So, a lot of the information, if you want it, is available online already. And so I do urge you to go to indianaclimate.org if you're interested, and that address will appear again on the very last slide of the presentation. So next slide. Well, if we look at the climate of Indiana, we can see over time, over the last 125 years or so, it has been getting warmer, but there's been a lot of interannual variability. The long-term trend is an increase of 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. That's shown by the dashed line that looks at the average across the whole time period, basically. Annual temperatures, year-to-year temperatures are shown by the red dots and connecting lines, and a 5-year running average is shown by the black line here. So the temperature moves around over time, but we are on a long-term increasing trend here in Indiana. We have seen much less warming of our climate than most other parts of the world and even of the continent. Next slide, please. So we have seen a temperature increase, though, and with that we see longer frost-free seasons here in Indiana. We get fewer cold days per year than we used to. And we also see significantly warmer overnight temperatures. So we haven't seen as much warming in the hottest temperatures of the day, the high temperatures of the day, but the overnight temperatures, the lows, have been increasing more. Next slide, please. We can also look at precipitation, and there we see a much stronger trend in Indiana. Over that last 125 years, we now get more than 6.5 inches of additional precipitation relative to what we used to, and really the most dramatic change has happened over the last 50 years or so, when we've had a big increase in annual precipitation statewide. Next slide, please, or advance. The increase in precipitation has not been uniform throughout the state. So if you look here, you'll see that southern Indiana and southeastern Indiana, really in particular, has gotten much wetter, 8 full inches of rain more than it used to get in that part of the state, and it's much less dramatic up in the northeastern part of the state. Next slide, please. In addition, we see that heavy rainfall is happening more often, and it's more intense when it falls. So in the Midwest in general, we now get 42% more precipitation in heavy downpours than we used to. Next slide, please. And we're also getting these events more frequently. So there are more days per year that exceed a 99th percentile event. So basically more days per year when we get big downpours. Next slide, please. And correspondingly, our stream flows have increased. And if you could see the very bottom of this slide, you'd see this is preliminary data from the water report that's coming out soon from the Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment. But this is just a graphic that shows the trend in average annual stream flow at different stream gauges throughout the state of Indiana. And any blue dot is a stream that has been rising over time. If it's dark blue, it's been rising significantly. And the size of the dot corresponds with the rate at which that precipitation has, or that stream flow, that average annual stream flow has been increasing. So we see our streams getting fuller and fuller essentially over time throughout most of the state. There are some small red dots there that are very small amounts of downward change, but overall, we see an increase in stream flows. Next slide, please. So then the question that we're really asking with the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment is, should we expect these sorts of changes to continue? And what are the implications of the changes that we may be seeing or expect to see in the future? So next slide, please. So we know that it's already the temperature has already increased by 1.3 degrees over the last century. Next, please. And what we find in the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment is that warming is expected to continue and really accelerate and intensify. So next, please. So what we have done here is we've taken 10 global models developed by different groups around the world that represent the climate for the whole globe going forward under a couple different future emissions scenarios. And we've looked at the specific outputs of those models for the state of Indiana, or the part of the globe where Indiana is. But these global models, they require so much computing power that they're not very high resolution in places like Indiana. And so what we've done is used a process called statistical downscaling to essentially increase the resolution of the output of these models so we can get a better idea of what the output of the models means or implies will be happening right here in our state, including some of the important gradients that we have in temperature and precipitation, for instance, from the north of the state to the south of the state. So we're trying to get a much more nuanced view of what the projections are from these 10 different relatively coarse scale models. Now, one thing to be clear about is that these 10 different models, they make different projections for the future. They don't completely agree on everything. They agree on some things, but not on everything. And so there is a range of possible futures based on these models. And what I'll be talking about is the average results across the 10 models, which in general do a pretty good job of tracking historical climate. And we expect to do a pretty good job of tracking what the future climate will be. Even though some models may be extreme in one direction or another, we think the average should be good. But second of all, there's also some unknowns in the future in terms of how many heat trapping gases we emit. What is the greenhouse gas emissions trajectory of our future, really? So we produced a couple different scenarios. One is a high scenario, high emission scenario, where essentially we're assuming that there's no additional policy to limit greenhouse gases, and so you can kind of look at it as a worst case scenario or a plausible but very high emission scenario, hopefully unlikely scenario. And then we used a medium scenario, which is much lower emissions. It implies that really the world works pretty hard to avoid future greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not in line with sort of some of the Paris targets. This is more pessimistic than that because, frankly, it doesn't seem like we're on a trajectory where we could meet that. So we made the judgment that this medium scenario is somewhere that is perhaps fairly likely to it's likely to approximate the reality of the future. So it's maybe more likely than the high scenario. So I'll be presenting some results from each of those scenarios today, but probably focus mainly on the medium scenario. Next slide, please. So in the medium and the high scenario, well, between the two, they predict 5 to 6 degrees of warming relative to the historical temperature in Indiana by mid-century. And mid-century here means the range of years from 2041 to 2070. We expect fewer mild temperature days where it's sort of pleasant outdoors. We expect more hot days where the temperatures are 85 degrees or hotter. We expect a longer warm season during the year and a milder cold season, all things that you would think would come along with 5 or 6 degrees of warming. Next slide, please. If we look at what that means for the state, we can look at the number of days per year we've had historically at 90 degrees Fahrenheit or above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in different regions. And you see that ranges from 11 days per year on average in the northeastern corner of the state to 41 days per year of 90 degrees or higher down towards Evansville. That's historical. If we advance the slide one, we can see what the medium scenario projects for the future for the mid-century. And now we're up at 42 days per year, basically the highest we had before in the southern part of the state. Well, that's what you see now in the northeastern part of the state. 42 days per year of 90 degree plus temperatures. And down around Evansville, you're looking at 90 days per year of 90 degree plus temperatures. So it's a substantial shift that we're looking at by mid-century. Next slide, please. This has implications. Well, of course, it's not totally uniform. The temperatures aren't totally uniform across the state. So we we get lower temperatures in general in rural areas than we have over cities because of the urban heat island effect, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And that also has implications for ozone formation, because where you have higher temperatures, you get ozone forming faster. So, so when we produce maps like that give you a sense of how many days per year might be above 90. I'm just trying to say that there is local variation around that, and you'll get pockets, you'll get microclimates where you have even warmer temperatures and even more days above 90 degrees, for instance. Next slide, please. And so I suspect you're familiar with ozone pollution, but basically ozone gas is a strong lung irritant. It's formed in the air as a byproduct, essentially, of other pollutants, other ingredients being in the air. Pollutants from combustion, basically, and a variety of sources react in the air to form ozone. It forms faster under high temperatures with strong sunlight, and so warmer conditions will make ozone form faster from any given set of pollutants that you might have in the air. And so the effect of ozone is going to be greater in downtown areas in general, or in urban areas in general, because you have more emission sources, and you have the urban heat island effect spiking temperatures a bit. So you can get ozone forming faster in the air. And of course, it does more damage in urban areas because that's where all the people are. So there are implications of these higher temperatures for health that are immediate and important. One thing I would say, though, is that vehicles are a relatively big source of pollutants, and if we manage to curb emissions from vehicles and other sources, then that's going to affect the rate at which ozone forms. And as we transition toward electric vehicles, which I'll bring up again in a little bit, that's going to reduce pollution in those urban areas. Next slide, please. Along with the change in temperatures, we're going to see changes in the patterns and frequency of freeze-thaw events, and that can have implications for pothole formation, among other things. So in Februaries in the past, or historically, we've had 2 to 6 freeze-thaw cycles per month, and the projection for the future is for that to increase slightly by mid-century to something like 4 to 7 freeze-thaw cycles on average across the state. Now, in any given locality, that's going to be different, and it'll vary from year to year, but a slight change in freeze-thaw, slight increase in freeze-thaw in February. Next slide, please. Well, let's look at the precipitation projections, because that's really been the major change in the past. We've seen that precipitation's already increased by 6.5 inches per year over the last century. And if we advance the slide, we'll see that the projection is that that's going to continue. We'll continue getting wetter in the state with a 6 to 8% increase in annual rainfall by mid-century. But if you go to the next slide, we'll see that that's not the real story. It's not the annual increase. The real story is that some seasons in particular are going to be wetter, and those seasons are winter and spring, where we expect there to be something like a 15 to 20% increase in precipitation by mid-century. Also, of course, those seasons will be warmer, so more of that rain or more of that precipitation will fall as rain and not snow. And that's going to mean we're going to have more early season soil saturation. That's a time of year where the plants really aren't active yet, and so they're not taking the water out of the ground. It's just basically sitting there. Next slide, please. So wetter winters and springs, when we don't really need the precipitation, unfortunately, that projection is consistent across the 10 different climate models that I've talked about before, as are the projections for warmer conditions year-round in Indiana. What is not consistent across the 10 models, though, is the projections for summer and fall precipitation. If anything, it's possible that summer and fall will be drier, or essentially there's some disagreement among the models, but there's not an indication that those seasons are going to be wetter. If anything, it's likely that they would be drier, particularly because it's going to be warmer. There will be increased water demand from the plants because of those warmer conditions, leading to drier soils during that time of year. Next slide, please. So if you want to know what Indiana is going to feel like according to these projections in the future, well, we can think about Indiana's climate in the summer now is having certain characteristics of Indiana's historical climate, shown on the left here, and the winter historical climate is shown on the right here. Historically, we have the climate of Indiana, but what states' climates will it feel like in the future? If we advance the slide, we can see by mid-century, our summers are likely to, in these projections, feel like those of Western Tennessee under the medium emission scenario, or southwestern Arkansas in a high emission scenario. Our winter climates are expected to feel like those more seen sort of on the Atlantic seaboard in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Next advancement, please. Thanks. And in a medium emission scenario, there isn't a lot of change past mid-century because emissions have declined a lot at that point. But so then our late century climates would remain around those of Western Tennessee in the case of the summer, and about the same location, say Delaware, in the case of the winter. Under a high emission scenario, if the world went down a high emissions path in the future, we could end up with a summer climate similar to that of Houston, which I'm sure that none of us wants to see. Next slide, please. So the changes in temperature and precipitation are going to affect all different aspects of the hydrologic cycle. It's sort of simple and complicated at the same time. By getting a wetter winter and spring and warmer conditions, you're going to change the amount of all the different factors on the right here. You know, the amount of time of precipitation, and the temperature affect snow cover. They'll affect the amount of runoff, soil moisture, evaporation, stream flows, flooding, and drought. All of this, and I'll run through some of the factors that I hope might be the ones that are of most interest to you in the next few slides here. So next slide, please. So this slide just shows how many days have historically occurred per year with 2 inches of snowfall or more. And so these are the sort of big snow days that we've had in the past, and we're looking at 3 different counties here, from St. Joseph County in the north to Vanderburgh County in the south. And you see, of course, in the northern part of the state, historically there's been more snowfall than per year, more days with 2 inches or more of snowfall than we see in the southern part of the state, where it's warmer and you don't get the lake effect snow as well. If we look going forward, we expect those snow days to basically halve. So the dark blue bars here are the medium emissions projections, and the light blue bars are the high emissions projections. We're essentially expecting those number of days with the heavy snow to cut in half going forward. And again, it depends on the time period and it depends on the scenario, but that's a rough projection. Next slide, please. At the same time, the amount of precipitation during those colder months, November to March, that falls as snow, that's also going to be cut roughly in half across these different counties. So we're looking at the same 3 counties here, the same different projections, the same color schemes, and what you see is that the percent of precipitation falling as snow is going, in those colder months, is going down dramatically. Next slide, please. When we get more precipitation coming down as rain, that means it can move through the soil faster. It doesn't linger on the surface as long. It's not necessarily going to do the same job of recharging the soil. I don't know. There can be complicated effects for runoff, but the bottom line is it's likely to run off immediately if it's coming down as rain as opposed to snow. And if we get more precipitation, then we're going to get more runoff as well. And so if one of the sources of our runoff is in the state of Indiana, particularly in the north, is agricultural fields. And many of those agricultural fields are tile drained. So they have perforated pipes underneath the soil that basically lower the water table. And they can contribute to water running out of out of fields and into streams relatively quickly after rainfall. And so we've looked at how much change there's likely to be in the water flowing out of those tile drains and into our streams during the spring from March to May. And what we see is in the northern part of the state, we expect there to be a dramatic increase, 40 to 70% increase in the amount of water that's flowing out of tile drains. That increase is also going to be dramatic in other parts of the state, just not quite as impressive. But the bottom line is for all of these irrigated, or not irrigated, for all these tile drained regions, we expect the tile drains to be dumping more water into the streams and rivers in the spring period. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of this precipitation and this runoff then for our stream flows? Well, in the forthcoming water report, we look at the implications for stream flows in 3 different streams. And I'm going to give you a sneak peek at one of those right now. In this case, we're looking at the average monthly flow in the White River as measured near Indianapolis. And we can see the historical average monthly flow in black here. So you see that there's a peak in flow in the late winter and early spring months historically. And if we look forward in the medium emissions scenario here, what we see is we expect that peak to be higher. And so we expect our higher average flows from January through May, essentially. The overall peak flow we expect to be higher, still occur at approximately the same time, but the peak is essentially extended later into the year. So we expect the peak flows to occur through April now instead of really occurring in March. And then in the other portions of the year, it's not as easy to see here, but basically in the summer and fall, we expect the flows to be lower than they have been historically. So we expect to push out a lot more water during the wettest months and have drier, this river in particular, we expect to be drier during the hotter months. Next slide, please. Now, this could have implications for bridges. I mean, the peak river flows in particular, I wasn't showing you the peak river flows in the last slide, it was the average river flows, but we do expect peak flows to increase too as you get heavy storm events on top of those higher average flows. This slide basically shows a high emissions scenario and what the expectation would be for bridge vulnerability for the increases in peak river flows you'd expect under high emissions scenarios. What it shows is that in different portions of Indiana, anywhere from 1/3 to almost half of the bridges might be vulnerable to the increases in peak river flows. Now, if you advance one, I think we can see the medium emission scenario and a blow up of Indiana. I believe this scenario is a little more optimistic than the medium scenario, but it is, greatly reduced emissions of heat trapping gases in this scenario. Then the changes in peak river flow would lead to many fewer vulnerable bridges in this region of the country. So the emissions trajectory, the future emissions, really do make a difference in what the projections are and in what their implications are for our infrastructure. So next slide, please. So I want to talk now a little bit about adaptation. And adaptation, of course, is just basically figuring out ways to be prepared for the changes that are coming down the line and make sure that they have the fewest negative impacts possible. So next slide, please. So I want to just give you a quote here. One of the most effective strategies for reducing the risks of climate change is to avoid placing people and infrastructure in vulnerable locations. That's from the National Research Council, and it seems like a good, just sort of basic line of thinking to keep in mind for planning going forward. We need to be thinking about where we're putting things and making sure we're not putting things in risky areas. We can expect that climate change will have impacts on infrastructure investments, but those impacts are going to depend on where those pieces of infrastructure are located. And there really needs to be integration then between land use planning and transportation planning to make sure that, in some ways, to make sure that our land use planning doesn't disadvantage our transportation planning. We need to be thinking about ways that we can use the landscape to manage these flows and minimize the challenges of peak flows in rivers, for example. Next slide, please. And I don't think that our current planning is necessarily doing a great job of estimating flood risk going forward. There's a new analysis by the First Street Foundation that you may or may not have seen this report, but it came out within the last 3 months or so. And it looks in depth at flood risks across the country and suggests that flood risks, including those from climate change, are greater than what people may have realized in the past in many locations. I think one thing we need to realize right now is with these projections, it's a little bit hard to picture the future. It's sort of like with the pandemic right now. I think even if we went back to just March 1st of this year or mid-February, it would be hard for many of us to picture where we are now and what's happened in the interim. It's because we're not good at exponential thinking in part. And we have loaded up the atmosphere with a lot of heat-trapping gases, and we're not going to be able to stop some of the consequences of this. And we need to be ready for the changes that are already basically baked into the system now and that we're not going to be able to avoid. And we need to be doing analyses that don't depend on past river flows entirely for future projections of what our rivers are going to look like, for instance. Okay, next slide, please. So the point here is that past experiences with extreme events should not still be a reliable indicator for future risk. They should certainly inform what our expectations are for the future, but we need to understand that we're not in a time of a stationary climate. Our climate is already on the move, and we already see changes in the magnitude of extreme rainfall events and their frequency. And our projections suggest that those are going to continue to change, and it's important to take those into account. And so the actions that communities are already taking and building stormwater systems that accommodate larger amounts of runoff and minimize sewage outflows are important and will only become more important in the future as rainfall and runoff patterns change. Should we also be thinking about our bridge designs and what they're accommodated, what sorts of flows they are designed to withstand? Should we also be thinking about the pavement that we're laying down? What sorts of compounds are we using? What sort of temperatures are they designed to withstand over time? Are we taking this into account when we're thinking about long-term investments? Next slide, please. So a quote from a technical input paper to the last National Climate Assessment, I think sums things up part of this up in an important way. Cities can enhance their adaptive capacity to climate change through their urban land management, which includes the legal and political systems, planning departments, zoning regulations, infrastructure and urban services, land markets, and fiscal arrangement. So the point here is that there are a lot of levers, a lot of different tools that we can be using and should be using to think about whether we are designing climate resilient systems in our urban landscape and in our infrastructure, and sort of all of these tools have to be on the table. We need to be thinking about this as a whole systems approach. Next slide, please. One of the major things we need to be thinking about is coping with the excess rainfall as we get wetter winters and springs and larger rainfall events. How do we slow down the runoff? Are we putting in rain gardens? Are we designing in bioswales? Are we putting down more pervious pavement in places where that's appropriate, so that we can get that water infiltrating into the soil instead of just running immediately into our rivers? Are we paying attention to nutrient stewardship to minimize runoff of nutrients and downstream pollution? What are our insurance options that we're looking at? How are they changing? Are we relocating infrastructure when we have the opportunities, and when we could be essentially taking it out of harm's way? Or are we working to buffer the systems against the impacts? What's the trade-off there? Is it more, does it make more sense to move something, or does it make more sense to armor it, essentially? These are things we should be thinking about going forward. Next slide, please. We have already some green drainage systems in place. Those are going to be impacted by climate change too. Are we designing our green structures, our green infrastructure, to be able to handle the future climate, or just today's climate? We need to be thinking about that as we go forward. And we have, as part of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, one of our reports is on urban green infrastructure. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to take a look at that at indianaclimate.org. Next slide, please. We also need to be thinking about mitigation. How do we minimize the changes that are happening, minimize the amount of climate change that we get? Next slide, please. So the transportation sector contributes about a quarter of our carbon dioxide emissions here in Indiana. It's an important contributor to our overall greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see it in the sort of reddish orange here. Next slide, please. Well, we can design our systems in a way that's going to minimize those emissions, and we're already going in that direction. And that's going to have benefits broadly and globally. Even though we're one small portion of the world, we can contribute to the reduction in emissions in ways that also improve our quality of life. And so some strategies that not only reduce emissions for greenhouse gases, but also at the same time, of course, they're going to reduce air pollution in sort of releases of pollutants that are going to harm our lungs, are things like roundabouts and electric vehicles. So roundabouts keep vehicles going. They're going to reduce energy use, fuel use, and improve air quality by reducing idling and keeping the traffic going. And they also reduce traffic accidents. So roundabouts already something we see increasing in abundance in the state, and that's a good trend for many reasons. Also, electric vehicles, they're much more efficient than gas vehicles. And as our power grid moves towards cleaner energy, they're going to be even more substantially reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, they also save on fuel costs and, importantly, improve air quality. When you move from a diesel school bus to an electric school bus, for instance, you're exposing many children to many fewer pollutants in a critical developmental portion of their lives. Next slide, please. And EV adoption is rapidly increasing throughout the state, but one thing we need to be thinking about is how do we facilitate that with infrastructure? So we have different challenges in different regions. If you're in a rural area, then maybe drivers passing through need an option for being able to charge up their car. Maybe it's not as much about the local residents needing to have access to that charging station. As you get into urban areas, though, you have more and more people living without garages. They need to be thinking about car shares, or if they have their own cars, they need to be thinking about, well, where can I charge up this car if I don't have a garage and can't charge it up easily every night? So how are we making charging options available to them near where they live or where they work that are convenient for them and fit in their daily lives? That will help facilitate the transition towards electric vehicles, which will help clean up our air and minimize climate change. Next slide, please. And we can also be thinking about how do we integrate renewable energy into the landscape. I think there's a lot of lands associated with our transportation infrastructure that could have a lot to offer in terms of the potential for renewable energy generation. Wind and solar power have declined in cost so much over the last decade. They're cheaper now than most, if not all, other sources of electricity generation in most of the planet, including many parts of Indiana here. And so we expect to see an explosion of solar and wind generation across the landscape, sort of dependent on county codes and things like that. Evansville is currently building the country's largest parking canopy solar installation. That's one example of how you can sort of combine infrastructure and transportation needs. How's this going to develop in the future in this state? There's likely to be a lot of changes in the next few years, so watch this space. Next slide, please. So I just want to mention briefly a couple resources that are out there that you might already know about. Next slide, please. There are some new resources from Purdue Extension that talk about climate change and communication, and they're aiming to help community and regional planners understand and prepare for climate change. You can access these resources from the Purdue University Extension Education Store. If you type in the keyword climate change, you will find them. So you can see a couple examples of them shown right here. So again, that's the Purdue University Extension Education Store where you can find these. Next slide. Also, if you don't already know about the Tipping Point Planner from Purdue Extension, I encourage you to check that out as well. It helps to develop watershed action plans. It's a web-based program that facilitates planners working with their communities on those sorts of things, and it has a variety of visualization tools that are useful. So that's available at tippingpointplanner.org. Next slide. And that's what I've got. Again, if you want to check out the Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment, you see the website right there, indianaclimate.org. If you want more information about our center, if you want to follow us on social media, we are at Purdue CCRC. Again, my name is Jeff Dukes, and a lot of the work that we do, especially on the Climate Change Impact Assessment, is led by Melissa Whitholm, whose information is also here. So you're welcome to get in touch with either of us anytime if we can be of help. And I think I have a few minutes for questions, so I'm happy to take those real quick.
Okay, it looks like we do have 2 questions. Would you like me to read those to you? All right, that's fine. We have one question from Scott Chandler, who asks, would returning the Kankakee River, for example, back to its natural path, including its floodplain, help with rising water levels expected in the future? Can this help in managing rising water tables and more rainfall?
So yes, I think, if you are essentially enabling rivers to spread out over larger areas where the more water can infiltrate into the ground, you're slowing them down, and you're slowing down the peaks of water flow. And so, yeah, that's absolutely going to be helpful to downstream communities. It's going to improve water quality. Of course, it's going to improve habitat, and it's going to make it just easier on any infrastructure that's downstream from there. So yeah, that's a great adaptation technique and a great thing to be doing for a variety of reasons.
Okay, we have another question from Joyce Newland, who asks, what are the 4 R's?
Oh man, so I'm afraid I'm gonna get this wrong, because this is something the extension agents talk about all the time, but as a scientist, I don't talk about it as much. But basically, it's when you lay down fertilizer in an agricultural field, you're making sure that you put that fertilizer down in the right amount and in a time and a place where the plants are going to be able to take it up immediately. So you're going to minimize the runoff of that fertilizer into the streams. When nitrogen gets into streams, and particularly when it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it causes algal blooms that create, when those algae die, they create dead zones. And so it's basically, dead zones are areas of the water where there's no oxygen left in it, and aquatic life can't live. And so there's a lot of problems with fertilizer runoff, and it's also bad for the atmosphere. When you put too much nitrogen fertilizer down, you get a big pulse of nitrous oxide off the landscape. That's a big contributor from agriculture to climate change is this gas called nitrous oxide that is released by soils when they have a lot of fertilizer on them and they're wet, and that nitrogen in the fertilizer gets turned to this gas, that is along with greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But basically the 4 Rs are about putting down fertilizer at the right time when the plants are going to be able to take it up, in the right place, so right near where the plants are going to be able to take it up, so where the roots are going to be able to access, the roots of the crops are going to be able to access it immediately, in the right amount, so you're not putting down more fertilizer than the plants can handle, and you're putting it down in the right form so that the fertilizer is releasing to the plants when they can get it, and you're putting it down in a form that they can take up easily. So I'm not sure if I nailed the 4 Rs there. That might be the 4, but that's the basic concept behind it, is that you're trying to minimize pollution and yet still maximize your crop growth.
Okay. If anyone else has questions, you can go ahead and click that orange arrow on the side of your screen that shows the control panel, and there should be the questions chat box. If you just type in there, we'll get your questions. You just have 1 or 2 minutes here left. I will also note that these presentations will be available on the county government website, YouTube, and we'll link to them from our website as well, so you can watch these again after the conference. I'm not seeing any more questions here.
What was that, Sally? I couldn't hear you, Sally.
Thank you. Last chance for any additional questions. And if not, then I'd like to send my sincere thanks to Dr. Dukes for this presentation. We expect when we meet again next year, we'd like to ask you back, I'm quite sure, for an update, and some of the other modules that you've been working on may be ready for in-depth presentation at that point. So you are getting all our virtual applause for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to get the camera working on my end here for whatever reason, but yeah, it's a real pleasure and honor to speak to this group who's doing such good work all across the state, and I'd love to be there in person to see everybody's faces and give you the update with probably our 2 most relevant outputs for this group, which are still underway. So yeah, that would be great.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we'll take about a 10-minute break now, so you can head down the hall or get your coffee or whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back and we'll start our next presentation.
But I just don't know, how do you do the video? Oh, there it is, share, okay. Get in there.
All right.
All right, I think we're there.
We're good to start.
Ready?
So are we on?
I think we're on.